Okay. Okay. So we have Jennifer Abadi again today. So I'm so happy to see you, Jennifer. And this is a special Passover edition that we are doing as we are preparing, the Jewish communities are preparing for the holiday coming up with the first Seder on Saturday, the 12th of April. And I have to introduce you to a very special book, which is called Too Good to Passover, and the author of which is sitting right here, Jennifer Abadi. So, yeah, Jennifer will talk about this book in detail. But
Yes.
let me introduce you briefly to this book. What is this book about? It's a compilation of more than 200 Passover recipes from 23 Jewish communities. And this is a cookbook memoir which provides an anthropological as well as historical context to the ways in which the Jewish communities of North Africa, Asia, the Mediterranean, and Middle East observe and enjoy this beloved ancient festival. So, okay, Jennifer, I'll let you speak about your book. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Boshali, and thank you for having me on this special day. As everyone in the Jewish community, or most people in the Jewish community, prepare for Passover. We're in the countdown stage of preparing. And just to give you a little bit of background about me and what I do to understand better how I came to doing this cookbook and why is I am a cooking instructor in New York City, and I specialize in food from the Middle East, the Mediterranean, North Africa, Central Asia, to name a few regions,
Mhm.
and with a subset focus on the Jewish communities within these greater communities. So after years of teaching, I got the idea, or I was inspired to write this cookbook after I offered several classes every year in Passover, on Passover. So Seder menus that were of varying backgrounds, not just the Ashkenazi ones that, especially in the United States, are most common, the recipes such as gefilte fish and matzo ball soup, but the food more that I grew up with, which was Syrian food.
Mhm.
I started teaching classes that were Sephardic, mixed with Mizrahi, also Italian seders, and they were very, very popular. And that's where I started to get the idea to collect these recipes that I was writing, preserving, developing, um, and start to also collect information about not just the recipes, but the traditions, the rituals, and the stories in how people prepared for Passover.
I just have
Um,
to stop you here once, just to
yeah.
briefly interrupt.
Mhm.
Would you just share your background very briefly? I
Oh,
mean,
yes.
yeah.
Excuse me. So I grew up in New York City, where I still live, in Manhattan. And my background is half Ashkenazi, half Sephardi. So half my family came from, I think originally Latvia,
Hmm.
Riga, and then the other half from Syria, from Aleppo. We call ourselves Halabi.
Hmm.
So I grew up with actually mostly the Halabi Syrian recipes
Hmm.
and traditions and foods. And my grandmother always used to make the Syrian foods for Passover. And we would have the big Seders with my cousins and my other family members. And so I didn't necessarily, I mean, we had like matzo ball soup, it was kind of a mix of things growing up here in New York. But we also had special dishes that, especially lamb, which is the focus of many Sephardic and Middle Eastern meals for Passover. We had that. Our haroset was a little different because it wasn't the Ashkenazi way of preparing with the chopped apples and the walnuts and the wine. We had always a date-based kind of haroset.
Hmm.
But uh, we had all kinds of other dishes too.
Okay.
And so that's my background.
Thank you very much. So
Yes,
now I'll
thank you.
let you continue about
Yeah.
the book.
So that's how I came to the idea. And and then I started teaching these classes and I started to write things down and do research. And after many years, I came to finally writing this book.
Mhm.
But the book had to change many times because originally, when I was writing it, I found myself um, trying to create, almost lay it out and design it in a way that was more like a traditional cookbook where you start with appetizers, maybe, then you have starters, main dishes, side dishes, and desserts. And
Mhm.
I found myself having trouble making it work until I realized that the reason it wasn't working was because that's not how you do a Passover Seder meal. So then I reworked it and I designed it so that it starts with, and also because I'm a teacher, and the way I try to understand different communities and recipes is I like to look at a map. I'm very visual. I like to see where countries are, who its neighbors are, the geography, and so on. So
Mm.
this book is more than just a cookbook. I mean, it's
Right.
definitely a book functional, like a textbook almost that you can read and follow recipes and cook from. And I really want the book to be used and functional, but
Mm.
it's also a book for people who really like to read and maybe don't always want to cook, or even people have come up to me and admitted that they're like, I just like to read recipes and it's
Mm.
almost like I'm traveling a little bit and just learn about different communities. So I just want to point out, just because this is the way it's laid out,
Mhm.
so you see over here, I have in the opening how to set up a Seder plate. There are
Right.
different ways of setting up a Seder plate.
Mm.
And so I explain that towards the beginning because there's also the a more Sephardic way of arranging things. And then every chapter, as I'll show you here, starts out with a map. So for example, here,
Mhm.
and the book is arranged in three sections, Africa, Asia, Europe.
Mhm.
And then within Africa, for example, you have Algeria, and I show you a map. You have interviews of people who are of Algerian background and their experiences of Passover and how to set up and prepare for the holiday.
Mhm.
And then the Seder plate. And the
Right.
Seder plate is very important, along with the full Seder menu. And everyone is different. So if that's Algerian, they have different Seder foods that represent that. There's Egypt, right? And they're different there.
Mm.
Um, some some different ones have, like Libyan is more of a tray. So I illustrate, and I did all the illustrations myself. So it's an illustration of not only the foods, but the type of tray or plate or table that they might have done. I also have Indian. So if you're interested in Indian, you
Yeah.
might be interested in that one, Pashali. Um, and then Syrian, Lebanese, and then also, for example, this one was very interesting. I didn't know any of these things till I met people and
Mhm.
interviewed them. This is Yemen, and in Yemen, they actually use the entire table. So this is actually an
Wow.
illustration of the table that they set up and use the whole table as a Seder plate presentation.
Wow.
And then it
So
goes on
is
through
there then
Europe.
communal eating? Then everybody, or also like, do they sit around the table and they just also eat from whatever is there on the table, or how?
Yes, they sit around I even had this one woman show me, like, you can see she's sitting at her table. And when I
Hmm.
walked into her house to talk to her, she'd already set up. This was, I mean, this was months before Passover. She reenacted the entire Seder for me,
Right.
like with the whole design. And they put leaves around the edges. It's very artistic and creative.
Wow.
So you have the leaves that are maybe romaine lettuce, that are
Mhm.
part of the Seder plate that they put around the edge of the table. So the whole table becomes the canvas in which
Wow.
you design. And then I have everything goes through Greece, Turkey,
Mhm.
Spain, Portugal. So I have all those different communities represented because each one was slightly different.
Mm.
And then different quotes and rituals and things that they told me and shared with me that they did, plus their experiences of preparing. And some were more took more time and more detail in their
Mhm.
preparations, which I'll get to a little bit later.
Right.
So that's how the book is laid out.
Yeah, I mean, I have the book as well. So, I mean, it's just so interesting, especially the different the different recipes from the different communities. And not just, as you said, it's not just a cookbook. You learn so much about the history, it's like an anthropological, yeah, collection of yeah, well done, really, I have to say. And I didn't know
Thank you.
you did the sketches as well. That's like
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah. Well, I
Good
couldn't do
job. Wow.
photographs,
Yeah,
unfortunately,
yeah,
because it was too expensive. So
yeah.
I decided to illustrate it. But But what was interesting to me is even I thought I was someone who knew a lot more, maybe than the average person, about differences in the different Jewish communities and especially since I grew up with Syrian traditions, mine was already different from many of the Ashkenazim, that the way they
Right.
did it here. And then I realized there was so much I didn't know and I was wrong about
Mm.
that was interesting to me. So it was really a learning experience for me as well. And then I wanted to share it. So the book is really meant to be used um, and be like an educational textbook, but also my goal, as always is, in whatever I do in the cooking world and in my through my teaching, is to preserve the recipes and the stories from being lost with every generation. So I feel like that's how I always present myself, as not just a cookbook writer, a cooking instructor, but someone whose my goal is to preserve the stories and the recipes that to me go together. It's the context with them.
Right.
So this one was focused just on Passover. And there
Hmm.
was so much to say because Passover to me is really like the Thanksgiving of the
Hmm.
Jewish holidays. It's
Hmm.
something that from maybe the most secular to the to the most observant will do every year, right?
Hmm.
Even if they don't really follow any other
Yeah.
holiday in the Jewish calendar, Passover is the one that almost everybody will do something for Passover.
Right.
So that's why I call it like the Thanksgiving of Jewish holidays.
It's kind of also like the identity of the Jewish people in some ways, like Exodus from slavery from Egypt, and also the sufferings and the fleeing that the Jewish people have had to do in different countries. I know that we'll come to that in a bit,
Yes.
but yeah, how do you connect this, like from the biblical story of Passover to modern day Passover?
Yeah, so that is a very good point because when we retell again, it's the telling of the story, right, of the Israelites fleeing Egypt from slavery, um, and going into the desert and that period of time. So we're telling the story to our and the ideas that you're telling to the younger next generations, right? So you're passing it on
Mhm.
orally, telling the tradition, telling the story, but also using symbolic foods to make it better understood for everyone. It's always easier to remember and connect a story and to history when you have something that's sort of tactile, both in taste and touch and texture, right?
Mhm.
And it's also very interactive, which is where all the rituals come in. Like sometimes some people reenact the stories. But what's interesting too to remember is the theme, right? So the
Mhm.
theme, there's the story, which becomes a theme. So the story is the leaving, the fleeing, the hiding,
Right.
okay? All these things, hiding your Jewishness, right? Leaving because you're not in a good situation or you feel like you can't um, be free, right?
Mhm.
And so in my book, when I interviewed people for each chapter, people who came from Algeria, people came from Syria, people whose background was from Portugal or Syria, Spain, Bulgaria, depending on when they left or if maybe their grandparents left or their parents left. Um, their stories also, I found, were like parallels to, in many cases, the story of the exes from Egypt itself,
Mhm.
where especially places maybe like Syria, where one family was telling me about how they had to leave one day, and this was like maybe in the late 70s, early 80s. So it was kind of a late time for Jews to be leaving Syria. And they had to just literally close the door, walk out and they had people who they paid to help them, and they walked through into Turkey and eventually left Syria that way, the ones who are coming from Aleppo.
Mhm.
So this idea of these stories that they shared, the people I spoke to sharing this with me, another woman from Bulgaria who talked about her growing up during the war, World War II, and
Mhm.
how she survived the war and finally left and eventually came to United States and settled here. So there are many stories of this kind of leaving, fleeing,
Mhm.
also hiding their Jewish
Mhm.
identity
Mhm.
that comes through. And I see the parallel. But it wasn't until I finished the book
Right.
that all of a sudden I saw all the different levels of what finally all came together because it was
Mm.
all one book. But through the food is the way in which I try to preserve the story, the history, and then also the recipe, which is the sort of the entryway to do all this.
Okay. So in your book, I mean, you have like I mean, you were showing us the book and the examples, and you have the stories, and then you also have the breakfast dishes, as well as then like I'm at a page where I'm looking at very interesting Afghanistan and Bukharia with the map and all. So then you have a person's story, and then you go on to the specific recipes, right? So,
Mhm.
um, and that's how every chapter is constructed. So, what was like, what in your idea was like, what was the idea behind structuring it this way?
Okay, so again, when I once I realized after it was almost like a puzzle, right? I was trying to fit and organize the recipes into a book. The book is what literally is binding all these recipes together.
Mhm.
And I didn't, whenever I looked at Passover books at that time, so my book has been out a few years. So at the time I was doing research was over 10 years ago.
Mhm.
The books that I saw were modern takes, which were great, like you would get like 10 versions of matzo ball soup by people. And it's great because it's inspired
Yeah.
and people want to experiment and try new things. But a lot of times I found the recipes to be almost disconnected from the story. And I
Mhm.
find the story
Mhm.
and or the history
Mhm.
to be very important to why that recipe is
Right.
made that way
Hmm.
and to continuing to teach and prepare that recipe,
Hmm.
right? And tell that story
Hmm.
through the recipe and or the other way around. And also there were, and I felt like sometimes these recipes were uh, not even by people who were even observing the holiday. And again, I have nothing against people preparing recipes for any kind of holiday, any Jewish holiday and everything. But I wanted to make sure that everything was brought together so people could see the connection between the recipes, the stories, and everything. So once I was trying to figure it out like a puzzle, I realized, okay, I have to organize it by, I didn't want to put, like, for example, just have a chapter on harosets.
Hmm.
That's how I did it at the beginning. But
Okay.
then I didn't know how to do all the other recipes because
Mm.
harosets are their own thing, and there are many. And in my book, there's like one for every community, 23 at least. So then I realized, okay, I have to start organizing it by region. So Africa, Asia, Europe, which is very broad, but I
Mm.
had to do it that way also because countries sometimes changed, borders changed.
Right.
Where people said they came from, the passports they had were
Mm.
not the same country then as they
Yeah.
are now. And it started to get so messy to me. And I was like, how do I do this? Okay, I'll do it very simply. I'll just do Africa, Asia, Europe, just to get it organized in some
Yeah.
way. And then I'll do by region, country, and also the way in which that particular individual community associated themselves, identified themselves. All
Mm.
right. Then I put the map. So I wanted people to see, okay, this is where it is.
Right.
Okay. Because you see that immediately when you open the chapter.
Hmm.
Then you see the interviews of, okay, these people, their background is from there. Then
Hmm.
you get to the Seder menu
Hmm.
opposite the Seder plate,
Hmm.
tray, table, whatever it is, because that is how, when you get to preparing a Seder, you're
Hmm.
thinking about those two things. Anyone who does a Seder, you're
Hmm.
thinking about what am I going to prepare this year? And most people have their every year dishes, right? They don't want to lose those traditional dishes. That's their family dishes.
Hmm.
But sometimes people now they want to experiment. They want to add a new recipe, but one that maybe still has a traditional tie to the
Yeah.
Jewish history.
Mm.
So harosets are usually that thing that's easy. So now people are like, all right, I'll prepare my Ashkenazi shredded apples with raisins and walnuts, but I don't mind also adding a couple of more.
Mm-hmm.
like a Sephardic one that's with dates.
Right.
Um, and then I have maybe a Persian one that
Mm-hmm.
has grapes in it
Mm-hmm.
or other dried fruit in it. Or the Moroccan one, the North African ones, which actually they mix with dried fruit and walnuts and wine and they roll into balls. I call them truffles, and they dip them in cinnamon and they serve it on a plate. And all of a sudden, start to see how varied the traditions are. There's not
Yeah.
just one way, but it's still Jewish. It's still
Yeah.
connecting to the traditions, the holidays. And so I think I noticed that people who, even if that's not the way they did it when they were growing up, they felt like good about doing something in a way that's still within other Jewish rituals and ways of
Right.
doing things.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have the Seder also foods. I wanted people to see, oh, sometimes people use a radish in place of another food or, something in place of horseradish or whatever it is so that they could not only understand that there are differences and there isn't one way of doing it, but also, oh, how can I stay within
Mm-hmm.
the tradition,
Mm-hmm.
but add to it, maybe swap out or think more broadly.
Right.
So that's why I put it that way and it's organized. And so then you have first and foremost your Seder menu because that's what people need to know. Okay, I want to look at Morocco. I
Mm-hmm.
want to do maybe this year. And I've had people who every year they've decided, okay, I'm going to go through your book and every year I'm going to do a different
Mm-hmm.
country. So this year we did Morocco. So we did the Moroccan Seder and the Seder plate. Next year we're going to do Turkey. The
Mm-hmm.
year after that we're going to do Ethiopia. And it's fun and it's engaging and it also keeps people learning and
Yeah.
maybe doing the holiday. Then you have the Passover week, which I think a lot of people forget. Like you still have a whole week to get through.
I was gonna say, yeah.
And all of a sudden it's like, great, the two Seders are over. And then you're like, oh my God, what am I going to eat like on day four?
Yeah.
So the leftovers are usually good for a couple of days, and then
Mhm.
everyone's like, but then when you talk to people, you find that there's so many recipes people do
Yeah.
that was for that time specifically, especially if you keep with tradition,
Hmm.
Jewish tradition and kashrut, where you don't have milk and meat
Yeah.
together in
Yeah.
the same menu.
Mm.
So during the week, you have an opportunity to do dairy dishes that are also Passover friendly and even
Hmm.
traditional, like maybe a matzah pie that's dairy.
Hmm.
Um, and you can do that. And there are lots of fun recipes you can do, but you still have to get through that week. And then there's the last night of Pesach, right? And how do you end the holiday? What dishes do you make, or one dish do you make that is basically what I started to sort of phrase or call breaking the bread fast or
Hmm.
breaking the fast for the holiday? Because that whole week you have what we call chametz, right? All the things that are forbidden to be eaten
Hmm.
during the holiday.
Hmm.
And it really varied. Many communities, they said when we were growing up, and especially if you were living in a certain country, there was no access to kosher for Passover
Right.
dairy, like cheese. So
Mm.
we didn't eat any dairy at all the whole holiday.
Mm.
So we would eat dairy when we broke the fast.
Mm.
Certainly bread was the most common
Mm.
denominator, right? So many people would eat something with bread. So if you were in the Middle East, maybe it was pita that you would go and buy
Mm.
out in an Arab bakery that was
Mm.
still open because remember, all the Jewish communities,
Mm.
their bakeries shut down the whole
Mm.
time. So they would go to those shops and they would buy those things. Some communities they would start preparing the food at sundown, right?
Right.
Some communities, and I'll get to those rituals later, they had big festivals and celebrations. So I wanted at least one dish for the Passover week, and then one dish recipe for that night to end the holiday because
Right.
the holiday does it's that full 8 day period
Mm-hmm.
from the beginning with the first Seder to the last night.
Mm.
That is the period. So you want to
Right.
bookend it and start and end it and make it complete. So that's why I said I'm going to go all out and do the full cycle of the holiday.
Yeah, and it's also very useful, I think, having a recipe like that, you might take it like we were talking about the rest of the days, to get through those 8 days. And in between, you can also choose to do another community. Like, it's kind of like celebrating Jewish cultures or cultures of different communities on different days. I'm not saying that you have to do
Yeah,
elaborate menus
right.
every
You could do
day,
that too.
but you could just take one recipe from another country another day, because it's still keeping with the um, laws of Passover, right?
Exactly.
The kosher,
Right.
the kashrut. So, yeah, I think that's quite interesting. Yeah.
And and each recipe and menu, especially the Seder menus, but each recipe, even in the Seder week and the break fast, it's a reflection. To me, the food is sort of a compilation. When I look at a dish, even if it's not Passover, but a food, I try to break down the elements of that dish to understand that community and culture
Yeah,
and time, right? To
absolutely.
me, it's
Mm-hmm.
like just like a piece of art or anything, but
Mm-hmm.
it is a manifestation of a culture. And
Absolutely.
so
Mm-hmm.
the name of the dish, I mean, there's so many things I look at and don't take for granted. So when you look at these dishes, and then also the way, not just an individual dish, but the way they're arranged in a menu,
Mm.
it's a story. It's a story, and they're put together, especially Passover. And also
Can
you
you
could
give
say
us
Rosh
some
Hashanah.
examples, maybe? Yep.
So in the Middle East, often the main dish is lamb.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Sephardic tradition, and the Mizrahi tradition, Middle Eastern, and also coming from Sephardic tradition, they'll also that will usually be the centerpiece, and that is to signify the scapegoat, the lamb that is slaughtered for to for the holiday, and in this is ancient Israelite times. So they want to put that front and center, whereas not every Jewish community necessarily always made lamb, and they didn't even have lamb. Like if you were in another community where you didn't have access and lamb was not something that was in your uh, community, then
Mm-hmm.
lamb was not the centerpiece. So lamb, many stories were that. So then they had, the vegetables. That I will also say, rice is not something that every community uses.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that I learned too, because I think that many people think that if you're not Ashkenazi, or if you say you're Sephardic, they often, what I know, because many people said this to me, oh, you're Sephardic, you're so lucky you can eat rice for the
Uh-huh.
holiday. And so I used to always laugh about that, because with Assyrians mostly eat rice during the holiday. So
Okay.
that's always part of the side dish, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then when I did the book, I started to realize that it wasn't totally true that every non-Ashkenazi uh, individual or family will therefore make rice. In fact, one person
Right.
I know who is Moroccan,
Mm-hmm.
and I have him quoted in my book, he told me, oh, no, 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 the Moroccans, we never eat rice. No, 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 never. No, you can't eat rice.
Mm-hmm.
The Tunisians, they eat rice. And the
Okay.
Algerians, some of them, they eat rice. Go speak to them. So I started to realize, oh, I really don't know all these communities as well as I do, as well
Mm.
as I thought I did. So,
So what
and
do they
then,
eat?
so for the Seders,
I
you
mean,
might
as a
have,
side, I mean, instead of rice, like what would be?
oh, potatoes are
Okay.
often the
Potatoes and
starch,
mince.
right?
Right.
So another way that people will within the Jewish community will refer to Passover, by the way, is the festival of the egg,
Mm-hmm.
which,
Yeah.
because so many eggs are used,
Mm-hmm.
not only because they play a very important function,
Mm-hmm.
which is the binding of ingredients. You can't remember, we can't use things that leaven,
Right.
um, right? We can't use baking powder,
And
baking soda,
mm-hmm.
yeast, right? So eggs also serve that purpose, not both in binding something,
Mm-hmm.
but also helping things to kind of lift and rise a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then, the symbolism, we have
Yeah.
it in the Seder plate, and it's
Mm-hmm.
different communities prepare it different way, supposed to also represent the sacrifice, but also fertility. Like there are all these different
Mm,
things. There's uh, other rituals and traditions with that. So eggs are really important. Um, and nuts also often
mhm,
play a big role
mm.
because they're ground up into flours of different sorts to use, especially when it comes to dessert, but you'll see them in a
Right.
lot of the harosets to
Mm,
give it kind of body and taste,
mhm.
but it gives texture.
Yeah.
So those two ingredients also become very important in your Passover week cooking
Right.
and menu.
Mm,
So. Um, so what I'd like to also talk about, because of also what we did in a previous podcast, I
mm,
think are the connections of, because this is something that's also very much in my book that came out when I was interviewing people and
mhm,
also learning about different traditions and rituals that are done in different communities.
mm,
And that's this parallel or story of persecution and antisemitism in particular,
yeah.
and in this case, the connection with Passover,
Mhm,
um, right? So things that happen either during Passover time in the past,
mm,
and not even that far back
mm,
past, depending
mhm.
on, and even specific to certain foods and things like that that we might do for Passover. So I
Right.
wanted to kind of bring that to people's attention.
Mm,
Um, so one thing that I thought, well, one thing I wanted to start with was an interesting quick little quote that someone shared with me
mhm,
named Brigitte, that she told me that her background was Egyptian. And she
mhm,
said to me once, my mother told us that as a child growing up in Cairo in the 1940s, it was funny to celebrate Passover, which commemorates our liberation from Egypt. At the time, they had a very happy life there. They didn't suspect that they would experience a second exodus a decade later with Nasser as the new pharaoh. This
mm,
is one of the unique stories about Passover when there was a significant Jewish community in Egypt.
mhm,
So I thought that was an interesting way because I always thought, like, I did ask people who either came from Egypt or had background in Egypt, oh, the story is about
mhm.
the Israelite slaves who were fleeing and left for freedom from Egypt, right?
Thousand
And then
years ago, thousands of years ago.
years ago,
Yeah.
many years, like the whole base of the story that we are
Yeah.
constantly telling, right? And we tell it as though it's so far back,
Yeah.
so as to make sure that that we constantly as a community in the present don't forget because we
Mhm.
don't want it to happen again and we want it to be on top of it. But
Right.
many variations of this kind of experience, maybe not exactly that
Mhm.
experience, but the idea of persecution,
Mhm.
we know for sure did happen again,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So that I wanted to start with is a quote, and especially because of the people who have Egyptian background.
Mm,
So I have one person who I interviewed here in New York who grew up in Cairo. Um, and spent time in Alexandria as well before
mhm,
coming eventually to the US.
mhm,
And that was his dream to finally come here. And also wasn't allowed to, in the 50s, Israel was established, right? 1947, 48. And being Egypt right there, he could not go to
mhm.
Palestine. They weren't allowing Jews to Palestine at the
Right.
time before Israel and with all that time. So there were a lot of problems in particular in Egypt
Mm,
for Egyptian Jews during that time leading up to that period.
mm,
Um, so he did tell me that there were a lot of problems for the Jewish communities in around 1939, 40, first in Iraq, Iran, and then in Egypt leading up to that period. And then he said there was one moment in Egypt that he will never forget. He
mhm.
said, I was coming back from school, and right near the synagogue, there were about 500 Arab kids screaming, and the
Mm,
police were all over. I asked my parents, what are you screaming? What are they screaming for? And then somebody yelled in the crowd, "Oh, there's a Muslim kid who is missing." That's what
Hmm.
they cried out. So then I said, "What do you mean missing? Where from?" I asked. And my family looked at me and they said, "Move it." I'm like, "Come on, let's go.
Mm.
Let's get out of here." I didn't know what was happening until I got back into the apartment. And my mother explained they're claiming that we took an Egyptian kid because of Pesach to get the blood to make the matzah,
The ancient blood libel thing.
the blood libel. I remember him telling me this, and I really have to say, even me growing up in New York and reading all these stories, I was surprised, not because I heard about this and read about this, but further back before somebody who lived through that experience.
Yeah, yeah.
And he told me that he was so, it affected him because he was very young. You know, he was a
Mm.
teenager or so at the time. And he said, "I never forgot." But then finally, he found out that one guy finally came out from the crowd and said, "We found him. We found him." Within seconds, they found this kid.
Hmm.
Um, because the kid had been in the mosque the whole time,
Hmm.
only a few hundred feet away. But the reaction of the crowd, he said, and the
Mm.
feeling he got was something that that
Right.
changed him,
Mm.
right? And that's when, there were a lot of problems with,
Mm.
that community. And eventually he had to leave. He just had to get out and leave. And he came to the US.
I thought somehow this particular blood libel was mainly in the Ages in Europe, but also in the Middle East, the same accusation. Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's worldwide. And I think that's why I want to point out that in this case, Passover is a quintessential Jewish holiday, right?
Mhm.
Um, it's a very specific holiday, and it's one of those. And so the matzah that we prepare for this holiday is is a recognizably Jewish food,
Mhm.
right? The flat bread comes in all different shapes, but traditionally, when it was handmade, especially, it was usually round and came in different sizes, handmade. But every year, the same time of year, more or less, in the spring, was when Jews would be preparing for Pesach.
Mm.
And in the weeks leading up to Pesach, they would have to find ways to make this matzah, this
Mhm.
special bread,
Mm.
to fulfill the mitzvah, the commandment of making this bread.
Mhm.
And not every, but most and many communities of people I interviewed shared with me how they had to hide the their production, how they made and when and
Mhm.
where this bread, because it was so recognizably Jewish
Mm.
that they knew people from the outside, whether it was the the authorities, usually, depending on where they live, maybe citizens, sometimes people, other neighbors, it would show it would reveal their Jewish
Right.
identity and they could get in trouble.
Mm.
So they had to do it quietly. And you can see by this story that I told that it comes out of this very story of the blood libel and the idea that matzah was being made out of the blood of non-Jews. In Europe, it was the Christians, and in the
Mm.
Middle East, it was the Muslims. And
Mm.
it was these rumors, these conspiracies, and again, a way of um, really kind of trying to take down this tradition, this part of culture, the Jewish history, right?
Right. Mm.
And finding where the Jews were. Who are you? If you're
Mhm.
making matzah,
Mm.
that's very suspicious,
Mm.
right?
So that was in Egypt. Any other communities you can share with us their stories?
Yeah, so I also have a woman, Bella, who shared a story, a quick thing. I mean, she had many stories, but one thing, she was the one coming from who fled Syria
Mm-hmm.
in the late 70s, 79, something like
Mm-hmm.
that. And there is a tradition by many Jewish communities, not all, to take anything that we call chametz, which is not kosher for Passover. Bread would be one of those things, and there are many others, and to sell it to a non-Jew during that time. So right before you collect all those foods you have in your house, and instead of just throwing it out, there is like this transaction. that it's like you're giving it away, that it's not no longer in your possession in your home, and you give it away to an and so you give it to a non-Jew, and it's
Mm,
like the idea of you're selling it, so it's definitely not any longer in your possession.
mm.
Um, this woman told me that in Syria, when she was growing up, they were afraid to give it to a Muslim. So if they didn't have, because they were afraid that if they did, that they would claim that they were poisoned by a Jew.
Oh,
If they gave them that food,
wow.
they could claim that the food that was given to them was poisoned. And they were so afraid, whether it was true or not, I don't know, but there was enough fear
Mm.
that they would just get rid of it. They would throw
Okay.
it out, they would burn it, they would whatever, but they wouldn't give it to someone because they were afraid it would come back to them again, that they're giving them their food.
Right. So this
So
kind of fear also shows that they weren't really sort of trusting peacefully coexisting people side by side. I mean, I'm sure there were a lot of cases, but where
yeah,
did this fear come from, do you think?
well, I really think it goes, we have to look at, again, history and politics matter.
Mm, mm,
And again, every story, not every story was exactly the same, depending on who I spoke to, the country they came from, and the time in which they were in that country, right?
mm,
So this woman was in Syria, Aleppo in particular, at that time, and she shared with me that story, that the fear, just in general, of being Jewish there
yeah,
was so much that they didn't really have, she also said, much interaction with non-Jews. I
right.
mean, you were in the street and you're a minority, so you were always there, but the
Mm,
interaction on a personal level, you kept separate. They kept separate from you, you kept it separate from them. So a personal interaction like that, especially on something that's like a Jewish special
right.
occasion and holiday, and
Mm,
that's religious in some way, they really didn't want to take the chance, which wasn't the case everywhere. I mean, there were other communities that would sell to, because again, it was specifically to a non-Jew. The idea is that they did this with each other, and it was in some communities something that people would do for Jews, right? And it
mm,
wasn't a problem, especially
mm,
other places, maybe Christians in other countries, like in Lebanon or wherever, there were some that it would happen. And even Muslims in other countries too. So it really depended on the country, the politics,
mm,
and the time.
That's
Um,
yeah.
Another story would be Amnon, who shared me, he grew up in Samarkand, which
Mm,
is now in present-day Uzbekistan.
mhm.
And he shared with me how, but you had to understand that the history of when he was growing up, it was part of, um, it was Russian,
Passion, okay.
right? So where religion wasn't openly tolerated, right?
Mm,
Any religion, right?
mm,
So he said that Bukharian Jews had to look for ways to still observe whatever traditions they had or they even knew, because depending on when they grew up in this region, they may not even know the traditions and holidays because they weren't even passed
mm,
down,
mhm,
which was interesting. So he said to me, since religious observance in Russia was illegal, all the food preparation secretly had to be done with the window shades pulled down.
mm,
Um, because they were afraid that people would believe
mm,
that Jews, again, would be taking the blood from babies to prepare the matzah, he called it, the matzah. He told me exactly, separately, same story.
mm,
So this is obviously a story that
mm.
is just, you know,
Circulator
it,
around.
this anti-Semitic
Wow.
story that goes way, way, way back
Mm,
to medieval times. I don't even know, way back
mm,
to the Inquisitions, even,
mm,
of a story of sort of, it's a conspiracy. It's an idea against the Jews that the Jews are doing things that are ill-intended, right?
right.
And because Passover is Jewish, how are they making this matzah? It's almost like a story created and then just retold, and it just keeps circulating. So what he would do as a result, and this is a ritual that the Jews would do, is they would reserve a block of time in someone's home, a Jewish home, and it was
Mm-hmm.
all like very secretly
Mm-hmm.
spread word of mouth within the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone knew, okay, this year, this place, this person's house has been koshered to use their home and their, to bake in their place. And families would sign up for time slots and they would go secretly. They would make their own matzah according to the law, right? They would leave it there because they were so afraid to also take it with them at that
Right.
moment.
Mm-hmm.
They would leave it there, stacked up, packed up in maybe a special box or whatever, and someone would return with their car and they would say at night under cover of darkness and take it away. That's how careful they
Mm-hmm.
had to be about the matzah. So the matzah really, what I find very interesting is not only is it symbolic of Pesach itself from the tradition of the mitzvah of preparing it
Mm-hmm.
for the Israelite Exodus, right? Going way back, and they didn't have time for the bread, the dough that they
Mm-hmm.
were preparing while they were fleeing and leaving and
Mm-hmm.
traveling, right? For it to rise. So then we get this unleavened bread, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now you're talking about the centuries later, where the Jews are still, in a way,
Mm-hmm.
hiding and fleeing and doing
Yeah.
things to make this very bread that is
Right.
symbolic of that time. So it's amazing how it's like
Mm.
a repetition or,
Kind of perpetuating
that
the
same
story
story.
continues, yeah,
It just keeps
every
continues.
generation. But that's why you also have the saying, right? And again, coming to Passover time, in every generation they rise up to kill us. So it's
Yeah,
so
and that's
true.
why it's sort of, I feel like we have to not only tell the story to remember a time way back when, as if
Mm.
it's in the past,
Yeah,
but we need to keep telling the story and apply other times, more recent,
yeah,
unfortunately, to keep reminding even ourselves that it has happened again, things, forms of persecution, aggression,
yeah.
antisemitism, because we have to be vigilant and we have to recognize that it's
Hmm.
not just a historical thing that goes back to biblical times, right?
Yeah,
So that I
exactly.
feel is our duty in Passover.
Absolutely. And also, I think mentioning these concrete examples is very important because often people think, oh, I've heard this really, like, oh, the Jews are once again, crying about their persecution, and there's actually no anti-Semitism. People were saying that, we've got rid of anti-Semitism, it's no longer there, but we see that in stories, it's never really gone, it's always been there, and it's important to share these stories. Um, I'm very interested to hear if you have any story to share about the Spanish Inquisition times.
So the Spanish Portugal, yeah, that one's full of things because
Hmm.
of the Inquisition. So um, I have many stories. So one story someone, David in Lisbon, shared with me is that the pau azimo, as they call it, pau azimo is the name for the matzah, which
Yeah.
just means
Hmm.
unleavened bread.
Hmm.
He said that during the days of the Inquisitions, which was like during like the 1400s. I mean, it went on for hundreds of years, but if you're talking about the
The
late
1492. Hmm.
1400s to 1500s. He said that during the days of the Inquisitions, using one's oven to bake the special Pesach bread because people needed to make their own. They couldn't use like go to a bakery. They
Hmm.
didn't have a communal oven to do that.
Yeah.
Um, it would, if they had done it at home, it would have produced visible smoke coming
Yeah.
from their home. And therefore, it would have attracted unwanted attention from these inquisitors, these special inspectors who were looking
Mhm.
specifically for Jews, people who are not Christian, right? Because Passover was that one of those times when they were like, oh, anything that looked like it was someone was doing something for that Jewish holiday would divulge that they're Jewish, right?
Hmm.
And that, so as a result, what families would do is they would instead bake them directly on top of their terracotta roof tiles
Hmm.
that had absorbed enough heat because there was so much heat from the sun, right,
Hmm.
in Portugal, and bake it that way instead of inside where the
Ah,
smoke
smoke
or
comes.
outside, however they would do it, that the smoke would not reveal.
Mm.
They would actually do it on top of their terracotta tiles, some of them.
And do you think
Um,
this is also something, a tradition that's become a tradition that the Jews in Portugal follow even till this day
I
because
don't think
of
they
the
do
past?
that
They
now,
don't. Okay.
but I think I have to look into because there's so many traditions. I feel
Mm.
like I did read some things of Jews who fled the Inquisitions and came to the Americas and went to like South America
Mm.
early days, during this time, that they might have done things like that
Right.
too, or
Okay.
certainly made their own type of flatbreads in ways to keep the tradition. If they did nothing else, this was the thing they did that people would do and find ways to do. That's why I'm saying that, if you do nothing else for Passover, maybe a quick story.
Mm.
You tell the story quickly, very casually. Like one guy in Moldova told me that his parents did not grow up with the traditions because
Mhm.
they were in the USSR and they didn't know anything.
Mm.
So his grandmother would tell a basic story, but there was nothing written down because
Right.
they didn't want any trail. So she
Mm.
just told what she knew. So he had an idea and understanding this dinner was just a little bit more special than a regular dinner.
Right.
I mean, that's it. That was to him Passover.
Mm. Mm.
And they did a little ritual outside to get rid of a few chametz, like as a sort of ritual kind of, but it was very low key, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so then getting back to Spain and Portugal, um, another thing that was particularly interesting was, oh, there was one story that a man named Adar shared with me that he
Mhm.
said that in the spring of 1506, which was 30 years before the Inquisition was officially installed in Portugal, there were a series of events that took place in Lisbon that led to a massacre of
Mhm.
thousands of Jews during Pesach.
Mhm.
You have to understand the time when there was a plague that broke out, and there also was a drought and a shortage of food in Lisbon. So there was a lot going on at that time. But again, this idea that when there's a great unrest, Jews often
True.
suffered a lot because
Yeah.
they became scapegoats and
Mm.
people were very angry and they were
Mm.
used as, reasons for which,
Mm.
for like targets for people's anger and disappointment. So he said in one Jewish home, someone opened the door for Elijah during their
Mm.
Seder. Um, but neighbors noticed that there was a Seder feast and they would
Oh.
turn them in to the authorities. So people also like during that time and in many generations later, people with a background of Sephardic, but especially Spanish, Portuguese,
Mhm.
will not open the door for Elijah even now because they stopped doing that because their ancestors couldn't
Mhm.
because if you open the door,
They were
then
persecuted.
people could turn you in, right?
Oh.
There's also a case where these Dominican, not in the Dominican, but in Easter Eve, Dominicans in Lisbon,
Mm.
um, they would warn the residents that Jews were abducting children. Again, the same
Mm.
thing for blood to make the Passover bread and other rituals. And then in the church during Mass, they were presenting this miracle of a glowing cross in the church, and they forced converted Jews who were forced to convert
Mhm.
during that time, they forced them to witness miracles, like to do things like publicly, right?
Mhm.
Um, but supposedly the story is, we don't know for sure, but the story is that one of these forced converted Jews made some comment about that when they saw the burning of the cross, and
Mhm.
someone turned this person in that they weren't respecting this miracle or believing in the miracle, and it resulted in the burning of thousands of,
Mm.
and the massacre of Jews the whole week of Passover.
Yeah.
So this was a specific thing that happened during that period of time, and this was 30 years leading up
Up
to
to
the
the.
actual official inquisitions.
Mm.
And then I will lead into one more that's very interesting. That's a tradition and ritual still done today.
Mhm.
It started during the Inquisition period in Spain and Portugal. It's something called, well, it's a Seder that is done on the fifth day of the
Mhm.
holiday, not the first and the second, but the fifth of the Inquisition, um, as a way of hiding the actual occasion and holiday, because when the inquisitors, the inspectors were looking, they were looking specifically those first and second days that
Mhm.
families were doing a special meal, a special dinner, right?
Mm.
So Jews started waiting and doing it on the fifth day,
Mm.
so as not to be discovered. And so when they started to do that, then that became a tradition in some Sephardic
Right.
traditions.
Oh.
Um, and one woman shared with me, she's a rabbi, Barbara Aiello, and she's in the Calabria region
Mhm.
of southern Italy.
Mhm.
And she said that this fifth night, what they call Seder Hamishi, which means
Mhm.
five in
Mhm.
Hebrew, goes back to the Inquisitions when the authorities would snoop around during Passover, right, to find out who was practicing Judaism. And the bounties were actually placed on Jewish families, where cooks, gardeners, maids would be paid money if they would denounce a
Sure.
Jewish
Mhm.
family who was doing any preparation.
Right.
But she also said that this was also a time when some good Christian neighbors
Mhm.
would invite Jewish families in to use a room in their own home, to
Mhm.
kosher a room in their
Oh, wow.
home, right? On the fifth, to use for the fifth night,
Mm.
when the Inquisition inspectors were not suspecting, but also not suspecting in a Christian home, right?
Right. Yeah.
And the Jews would observe their Seder there, and that became a tradition. And now some families will observe, and especially this rabbi told me that they will still, and she grew up doing this, and she continues to this tradition on the fifth day to
Mm.
have this Seder as a way of commemorating not only the Inquisitions and the Jews who were persecuted during
Mm.
that time and had to hide, but to honor
Mm.
the non-Jews who were like allies, supported them,
Mhm.
protected them, hid them. So
That's
it's
a
like a
very, very
twofold.
good. Right. And that's a very good point. And I think that's, yeah, I'd like to kind of wrap up this with this positive
Okay.
note, because it's just such an important point this rabbi mentioned, the fact that there were righteous among the nations, who hid the Jews
Yes.
or who allowed the Jews to celebrate Passover even in their own home, knowing that they could also get, yeah, tortured and
Yes.
whatnot. So, and we are living through modern day anti-Semitism in a like a, I mean, we all know about the global rise, surge in anti-Semitism and what the Jews around the world are facing now. So it's an inspiring thing. It's an encouragement for non-Jewish allies to take this bold step and side with their Jewish community friends and help them out wherever possible because people in the past they risked their lives to do that. So yeah, that's a
Yes.
very
And
inspiring
I encourage
story.
people, yeah, and what I would say is that in conclusion of all this, I think I've been inspired over the years after I wrote the book and learned so many other people's stories, and rituals and traditions. And over the years, what I've been doing is adding to my Seder, both in the menu where I have many different haroset. I might have like five, six different harosets at my
Mm.
table. It's almost like a Seder haroset tasting,
Mhm. Mhm.
where you can learn about the different types of harosets, but
Mhm.
also my Seder plate and some rituals that I'll do before, during, and after are inspired by other communities,
Right.
not necessarily my own. And I think that, for example, one thing I do with my kids and I'll do also with kids who come to our Seder, because usually like the second night we'll do first night family and second night I'll do friends and we'll invite friends, families and friends of my kids.
Mm-hmm.
What I'll do with the kids is I'll have them take haroset, and I'll have a special haroset. It's a little on the side that's like a little bit watered down, um, for them to kind of dip their hand in it and then put it on a piece of paper to mark the paper. And then when it dries, everybody takes it home and they put it in front of their door. And
Mm-hmm.
the idea is to mark your door like they
Yeah.
did way back in time
Mm-hmm.
with the blood, right, of
Mm-hmm.
the sacrificial lamb to mark your door so that the angel of death would
Mm-hmm.
pass over your home. And it's sort of like a good luck charm, if you will, but also symbolic and interactive and a way of connecting with the history and the story. So we'll do that. I'll do that every year, and the kids like to do that. And we'll hang them up with their handprint in front of the door.
Right.
Um, Another thing we'll do is we'll take the afikomen and a piece of it, and I will give every person present at that Seder a piece of that afikomen, which some communities do. It's considered holy. That the matzah from the Seder is considered holy,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll give them a tiny little piece. I'll wrap it and I'll put the year of the Jewish calendar year of that Seder on it. And I tell them to go hide it and put it away near, in their bedroom or near a special place. And that's like for good luck. Um, and another thing I did last year for October 7th to commemorate the hostages and those who were killed on October 7th was to make like a little poster with a
Mm-hmm.
blank silhouette that said missing, right? For all, like after all the posters that we kept seeing of all the hostages were missing. And I put it on a chair, an empty chair that was almost like the chair for Elijah, but also the chair for the missing person that was either kidnapped or killed. And you could do many things. People can do all kinds of things that they want to add. And I encourage people this year to add to their Seder because it should be always evolving because we want to keep it present. We don't want
Mm-hmm.
to forget, but we want to make it relevant because we don't want to always say, oh, it's in the past, it's history.
Yeah.
Yes, you
Yeah.
want to connect the history
Absolutely.
to the past as we move along.
Mm-hmm.
So we really understand why we're doing it and to hopefully recognize when bad things are happening again so that we can call it out. And I think that's what we have to, it's a living thing. We can't forget it.
Yeah,
That's what
and
I'll
it's
say.
also about the Passover tradition is also about sharing stories of from the
Yes,
exodus
right.
from slavery to freedom, and there are still 59 people in Gaza right now, and 24 of them are still living what we know.
Yes.
So we can share their
Another
stories.
Pesach.
Uh,
Share
yeah,
their stories,
their
share the
stories
story.
and
You could even read stories from the book of people who are interviewed about how they did Passover. Like, yeah,
yeah.
you could tell your own story,
Mm,
share stories, people in your family or people who come, and
mm,
even people who are not Jewish. Like I think it's good to, especially these days, bring the greater communities, the non-Jews, your friends, your allies, your
yeah.
supporters, to teach them, show them what you're doing
Mm.
and why, right? Not
Exactly.
to be too so isolated.
I know. I mean, in my city where I live, the Chabad is very good at that. You know, they organize the seders and they also open it up to non-Jews who are
Oh, great.
well, who are somewhat connected, who maybe they've been really advocating for Israel and the Jewish people or whatever. So they also get a chance to be a part of the Seder, and it's so beautiful to just see that. So I would encourage, people who are listening to this that if you're a non-Jewish person and you know of a Chabad who offers such opportunities, go. It'll be really good. And it's long because people love, it's a time of
Yeah.
connection, putting away your phones, connecting and sharing stories. So it's a very special occasion. So, yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for mentioning that. And do
Yeah.
you, just
Thank
very
you.
briefly, could you share a bit about the pre and post Passover rituals that the different Jewish communities have?
Oh, okay. So, um, I'll give you one thing that I found really fascinating was
Mhm.
an Ethiopian tradition that someone shared with me that they would do in again, the weeks leading up to the Passover Seder, they would break all their old dishes and pottery. But
Huh?
in order to understand the meaning of this in this particular community, you would have to understand why, what the connection is to the pottery. So the Jewish communities in Ethiopia weren't always allowed to do do every profession that they wanted. They were limited in terms of what they could do, where they could do it. So one of the professions they had was doing crafts and making pottery and textiles and things and by hand and selling them to non-Jews.
Mhm.
So pottery became a big part of the Jewish community's sort of uh, profession and trade, right? So it became almost like a symbol for them during Pesach, because also Passover, many Jews know that some who are very observant, they have separate plates and bowls and utensils just for Passover, right?
Mhm.
If you're able to do that, you have separate ones just for that holiday and nothing else all year. Many others, what they'll do is if they can't store it, they can't afford it, whatever, they would have to kosher
Mhm.
all the plates and utensils and the cooking utensils every year before Pesach, before they can prepare for Pesach.
Mhm.
In this tradition in Ethiopia, the Jews would actually break everything that they made because of these special clay pots made with a special clay
Mhm.
that could be used in Ethiopia. And they would paint it with they have different colored clay because also the land was a particular way. And they would remake all new pots and everything to be used first on Pesach, because also remember Pesach happens during spring. It's a
Yeah.
time of renewal. It's not
Yeah.
just about commemorating the losses, the
Mhm.
hiding. It's also to commemorate and to mark spring and
Right.
renewal
Yeah.
and hope.
Mm.
Okay, we have to remember that. It's an
Hmm.
ancient tradition,
Yeah.
not just about the all the other things we mentioned.
Mm.
So the first occasion is to use that pottery, and then that's what they use for the rest of the year until the next holiday, Pesach, they break them again. So that was a very interesting pre-Passover
Mm.
holiday a tradition that I learned.
Beautiful.
Um, and then, of course, the cleaning was
Mm.
always very big in very traditional homes, down to not just going through every room, but in Syria, places like Syria and even Egypt, many people told me that the day after Purim, which is a month before Pesach, they started working from one room to the next, maybe depending on how many rooms they had. And once that room was clean, it's like you almost can't even be in there anymore. Certainly couldn't eat anything in there anymore, but they had people that they would bring in, sometimes people who weren't Jewish, some people who would come in and they would take all the stuffing out of their mattresses and pillows and put in they would open it up, they would pull out the stuffing, the wool, and they would put in fresh wool and re-sew it. That's
Mm.
how far they would go, and repaint all their walls.
Oh, wow.
That's how far they would go to like renew, clean,
Yeah.
fresh start.
Yeah.
Um, Other traditions I mean, there were so many.
And anything post Passover? Something
Many post-Passover. The
yeah.
most
Maybe just one.
known, yeah. So the most known in the Jewish world is the North African, specifically Moroccan and Algerian tradition of Mimuna,
Hmm.
which takes place the last night of Pesach at sundown, after the sun. So the holiday has to be in a full cycle finished, and then it's a full celebration.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's called Mimuna, which is really its own celebration, but it happens at the heels of Pesach. And it's a time when Jews also are celebrating spring. So they have a full plate. It's almost like a full table set out with one thing that's very important is products that are with chametz,
Mm,
like wheat.
mm,
Okay, so sheaths of wheat, big
mm,
uh, pieces and things of wheat that they pick for spring, and often guests would bring as gifts to
mm,
them. And they would have different things made, like cakes and breads they would put out. Sweets are very big.
mm,
Dairy that they may not have been able to eat during
mm,
Pesach, they would put out pitchers of milk even. So that's very popular.
mm,
And this is a special time for people to visit friends and relatives. So the doors were open,
mm,
and people with families would visit, like maybe the rabbi and a special order family, but they would go, it was like open houses.
mm,
But one thing I want to also mention that ties in also earlier with the sharing
mm,
of neighbors.
mm.
This was also traditionally a time of a celebration that was shared between Muslims and Jews. It
Wow.
wasn't just
Mm,
Jews.
okay.
Jews and Muslims would do this together, and Muslims would also come. Christians, everybody would be coming and visiting their neighbors and their friends and share
Mm,
maybe the first bread with them,
mm.
with the Jews, or
Beautiful.
so it was a beautiful time
Yeah.
and wasn't as separate that I
Right.
feel it has become in the Jewish
Mm,
communities, and they should
yeah.
know. I mean, I had someone who told me who was from southern Spain, and he
Mm,
wanted to, who wasn't Jewish, and another one who was Muslim Moroccan, who told me they remembered growing up participating
yeah.
in the Mimuna celebrations that
Mm.
Jews and Muslims did together.
That's beautiful. And that's the hope we have, right, for the future. May we be in a
Yes.
few in a near future where we will do that together. And I remember also in India, it was just very common for all communities, like non-Jewish communities, to come and celebrate with the Jews as well, you know.
Well, when you bring up India, they actually had something called, I think, Malida,
Yeah,
which is a
Malida. Hmm.
Thanksgiving
Mm.
service. And it was actually even 1 or 2 weeks later. Like it
Yeah.
seems very far from Passover, but there is still every holiday kind of leads to another holiday. But it's following Passover, and families told me, especially in Mumbai, formerly Bombay, they said they would take a bus in the morning to the beach and they would have a picnic Thanksgiving offering and sacrifice for the altar and the days to commemorate the days of the temple. So they would do this picnic to commemorate the sacrifices that were once done. And it was to also symbolize the days of living in the desert.
Mhm.
Um, so it was they had several times they would do this during the year, but they would also do this
Mm.
1 or 2 weeks after Pesach, like
Right.
going
Malida is
outside.
also, yeah. Yeah, beautiful. So, well, there's so much to learn, and I just would encourage
I
everybody to
know there's so
get
much, and
this
there's many
book.
more. Like I have
Yeah.
pages and pages that I couldn't even
Well,
get
it
to.
is a big book, right?
Yeah,
It's
it's a big book.
mine
Yeah,
is not showing,
it's
maybe you
thick.
show.
Yeah, and the
Exactly.
worst comes to
So
worst, you can use it at your Seder for the youngest child to sit on top so they can get. It's like a booster seat.
yeah, but hopefully people will make recipes out of
Yeah,
it. And there's just
yeah.
so
It's
many,
it's meant to be used. It's
yeah,
meant to be
and there's
used to
so
get
many
splattered on, food
amazing
on,
stories, right?
not a coffee table book, in other
Yeah,
words.
and it's so many
Yeah.
amazing stories that one can learn from. So, and stories that we should not forget, the communities.
Yes.
So,
No,
thank
for
you
sure.
so much for joining me. And once again, Too Good to Passover is a versatile and inspiring reference cookbook appealing to those who may want to do a different theme each Passover year, with possibly like a Turkish Seder one year, a Moroccan one next year, and an Afghan one the year after. So, it's amazing. And it's also, would you just mind showing the book again, the cover?
So this is what it
Yeah.
looks like.
And it's available to buy on Amazon everywhere in the
Right.
United States, as well as Canada, France, Spain, Italy, Germany, the UK, Australia, India, and Japan. So thank you very much for sharing these stories. And yeah, we look forward to the Passover.
Thank you, Pasha. And I also want to mention that if anyone, you can go to my website, jenniferabadi.com, and you can always get in touch with me if you have any questions. Even if you wanted to order a book or have a book sent to you or to somebody else signed within the US, it's easier. I'm happy to do that. Just email me. And sometimes I do classes. So if you want to sign up for virtual cooking classes, or if you're in the area, if you want to organize a private class, I do classes throughout the year for kids, teens, adults, all ages, for all occasions. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, that's great. So if you're somebody living in New York, contact Jennifer.
Yes, please do.
Okay.
And I
Well, thank
want to
you
wish
so
everyone
much.
a Chag Sameach, a
Yes.
happy, healthy, safe Passover.
Yeah. Thank you. The same. Okay. Bye.
Thank you, Bashali.
Bye.
Thank you.